So I've been reading a book called Models of God and Alternative Ultimate Realities. And it's really a series of articles. So it's got many different authors that have contributed. And it basically goes through different sections laying out the different frameworks that we have for God. And for anybody that might find it strange to think of this idea of models for God, maybe that sort of minimizes this transcendent being. But I think it's kind of the opposite. I think that we think in terms of models of God because if we believe that God exists, we have to imagine that we can't fully comprehend this being, and we certainly don't have all of the information as of yet. And so we have these models that help us to understand as best we can what God is like. And so these different frameworks give us a sense of how we can think about the nature of God. So the first thing is classical theism. This is the first section and the first series of articles, and I just want to talk about that briefly. Most people, at least in the West, have a basic intuition of what classical theism is, but I just want to talk about a couple of things that maybe a lot of people don't think about when it comes to classical theism. So to start out, the idea really stems from Greek philosophical thinking, and in particular, Aristotle is the one who articulates sort of this framework for a perfect being, an ultimate being, the unmoved mover, as he puts it. And this idea is carried forward by Augustine, and the idea of the most perfect being is articulated by Anselm in the medieval period, and then just shortly after that, Thomas Aquinas is the one who most thoroughly articulates the idea of a classical God systematically. So the basics, as most people are aware, are the idea of a God who is omnipotent or all-powerful, omnibenevolent or all-good, and omniscient or all-knowing. I like to say it as perfectly powerful, perfectly good, and perfectly knowledgeable. So this is kind of the core and what we'll have to talk about more moving forward. But some other aspects that aren't necessarily on the forefronts of people's minds when they think about this issue are things like God's aseity, which basically means that God is self-sufficient or doesn't depend on anything to exist or to persist. The idea that God is eternal, which is an interesting question and has some very interesting implications. The idea that God is immutable or doesn't change, which most people tend to be pretty comfortable with on the surface, but also there are some interesting implications that come from that. Also that God is impassible, which means that God is not affected by the world. This one is one that most people tend to have some trouble with. The issue here is that it kind of speaks to a God that isn't relational. If God cannot be affected by the world, that is by the beings like us that were created, then it seems like there's no significance to a relationship with such a being. This would indicate that God is not sort of a compassionate being, as many people would like to think. And so this is one of the issues that leads to different models of God. But before talking about those, one of the interesting things is the idea of God's eternality. And I think this is often misunderstood. Perhaps people think about eternality as God experiencing time for eternity past and eternity future, kind of like if you and I were to just live forever or something. But the idea of God's eternality isn't just that God exists for eternity past and eternity future, it's also really that God is above or outside of time. Some say God is sort of in front of time, drawing it forward or something like this. But the idea is sort of strange, and it's hard to wrap your mind around when you think about it, because there would be no before creating the world, because time in God's framework doesn't really exist, or at least God doesn't experience time the way that we experience time. all of the universe, or at least all of created beings and their experience of time, is sort of an instantaneous matter to this divine omnipotent being. And so it's sort of like God can still have a relationship with the you of the past and the you of the future, because God is seeing it all within one instantaneous moment. This is really sort of strange when you think about God's experience of the world. Can God have an experience of the world if there is sort of no change from moment to moment? This is a major question, and another thing that causes some people to question the whole idea. We can get to the issues of omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and omniscience momentarily, but what I think is really important to understand here is that this idea of the perfect omni-being, it's sort of like a thought experiment that developed in ancient Greece by the philosophers. And the question is, do these brilliant thought experiments necessarily point to something that is true and real? The idea that many people have right now, most people in fact, at least in the West, stems from ultimately these few thinkers and the way that they considered God had to be based on the idea of a perfect being. They thought there has to be something that is better than everything else. The way Anselm puts it is, God is a being of which nothing greater can be considered or thought. So we can't conceive, theoretically, of anything that is better or more perfect than this being. And so that's basically the definition of God. The definition of God is the most perfect foundational being of existence. So while that seems to make sense, at least on its face, the question is it true? If it's an idea that's formulated by humans, does it necessarily mean that it's true? So that's the first thing moving forward. And I think this is why other models have been proposed, and many people are comfortable embracing different models of God, because it's not necessary to suggest that even though these ideas are sort of heady and seem really brilliant, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're true. But the bigger issues, I think, are just how these don't really seem to align well with our reality. So going to the kind of threefold definition of this perfect being God, the perfectly powerful, perfectly good, and perfectly knowledgeable God, there are a few issues with this. One is the issue of free will. The other is the issue of evil. These are kind of the main ones. Of course, most people are familiar and aware of these arguments and why there's maybe some troubling thoughts when it comes to thinking about this sort of God. The first issue of free will, of course, is that if this all-knowing God created the world that has a complete existence in the past and the future from our vantage point, then that means that everything that is going to happen in the future is already set, it's already determined, and so we don't really play a role in determining what's happening in our day-to-day lives or in our futures at all. Ultimately, it's sort of an illusion, and it's all set because God ordained it upon creating the world. So that's the first issue. Then there's the issue of evil. Many people are also familiar with this one, and the problem is that if there is an ultimately powerful and ultimately good God, then why is there evil at all? A good God wouldn't want this evil or allow this evil to exist, and certainly if this God was powerful, then this God could prevent this evil from existing. God could have created a world in which there is no suffering or no evil, and we just live these happy lives without any of the negativity. And that's hard for us to comprehend now. You might think there's no way for that to possibly be. We couldn't experience good without the bad. But if God created a world wherein we were capable of conceiving of good without bad, then we would, and that would be great, right? So that's the idea. If God can do it, then why didn't God do it? And this problem has been well established and acknowledged for a long time, which is why other models emerge. There are a variety of other logical problems with this sort of God as well, certainly not as troubling though. For example, there are certain aspects to this sort of nature that are contradictory. For example, if God interacts with the world in some way, then how can God not experience time? Questions like this are really difficult to articulate and really difficult to comprehend, but there's inherently a clash just because of our intuition in how the world works. I will say that we tend to misunderstand certain aspects of this. It is very thoroughly fleshed out by people like Aquinas. As an example, when we think about God's relationship to the world and impassibility, Christian philosophers, at least in particular, would suggest that God's got this perfect, infinite joy in God's self by just existing. And so one might suggest that this is incompatible with having a relationship. How can God experience the joys or the pains of a human being if God has this unending, perfect, infinite bliss or something? Well, the idea would sort of be that this perfection can be added to, but that doesn't really change it. It's sort of like having infinity and then adding 1 or 2 to infinity. It's still infinity, and this finite number doesn't really change it at all, ultimately. And that's the same sort of idea that people like Aquinas would suggest about impassibility. God's got this ultimate joy, and it can't get any better. However, God can still add our joy to that. It doesn't really change God's experience, but it does kind of filter in there somehow. So things like this are really kind of heady and largely misunderstood. However, I do think that there are certain problems, as many philosophers and theologians would agree, with this sort of foundational threefold definition of God: omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. And so what I want to talk about next is different sorts of models that come from trying to make sense of God or the idea of God in our world. So stay tuned for these.